ensayar rápido, ¿no? Tú sabes, pone empieza, esa es una que lo ensayas rápido, ¿no? Tú sabes, pone empieza, esa es una que lo ensayas rápido, ¿no? Tú sabes, pone empieza, esa es una que
the kid's uncle, and he becomes Spider-Man. You
Well,
want to
we're
get
back.
out of that.
We're back on. We were talking about superheroes here. This is Civil Discourse now. I'm Mark Small.
Paul Ogden.
I'm just saying, if your name is Ben and your nephew becomes Spider-Man, you want to get out of that house really, really soon.
All right.
So said Matt Stone, a guest panelist today, blogger on Indie Student. Our other guest panelist is Tom Ayer. Tom has raises funds for not-for-profits. Tom, we're discussing events led up to the Civil War, presidency of Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, and we're going to talk about the movie eventually.
Mm-hmm.
We'll talk about at the end of this segment and during next segment. Matt raised a very important point when we were off camera, and that was the integration of the military during the Civil War.
Yeah. Well, the Northerners kind of had this. They basically let African Americans join up under various. I mean, there were still. It's important to remember that there are some slave states still in the Union during the Civil War, mostly border states, Maryland, Kentucky,
Tennessee.
and I forget Tennessee.
Oh.
Not
No,
Tennessee.
Missouri.
Delaware, Missouri,
Delaware.
Delaware, and these states still had slavery. They even had slavery after the Emancipation Proclamation, and so sometimes the army would take in those who were enslaved and promise them freedom and stuff like that, and some of the freed African Americans would join up, and they were usually given lesser positions. And it was usually a long haul, but nonetheless they did fight in the Civil War and in the Confederacy, because one of their main sticking points, and it wasn't only about slavery, but that was one of the big reasons the Civil War happened. They did not let the African Americans in the Confederacy fight until very, very, very late in the game, when the writing on the wall was almost done.
Well, and a couple of things about that. One is that the British during the Revolutionary War, that was a very effective tactic that they employed, was guaranteeing freedom to those African Americans or people of direct African descent who volunteered to fight for the British.
Yeah, and it turned out not to work too well for the British. Well, they really didn't have. They had more success with the natives actually than with the African Americans.
And that's another show. We keep going into different shows, but the other thing is, when you're talking about the African Americans being enlisted and I lost my train of thought because you interrupted me there. But we were talking about.
I think you said they were desegregated, but they
weren't
were still segregated.
I want to say
in the
segregated.
army.
Yeah, they were still treated differently.
They didn't fight side by side.
One of the African American actors in the Lincoln movie mentions about being lower paid, or they had to pay for their own uniforms and stuff like that. They had their own units and stuff like that. It was only really during like the major conflicts that they would all come together, and they were usually given the more routine jobs. They usually were on the front lines and stuff like that. So it was not desegregation, it was not equality. But at the very outset of the war, the Union, the northern states, let African Americans into the military right away. It was the Confederates that held out until they really needed the numbers.
And for two things. One, I remembered what I was going to say, is that the Civil War really was about two reasons. From the Southern perspective, it was about slavery. They wanted to preserve the institution. From the Northern perspective, they wanted to preserve the Union.
Yeah.
If you had told people from the Northern states, we're going to fight a war to try to end slavery, a lot of people would have been, they wouldn't have been as supportive of the war. Once we got beyond a certain point in the Civil War, they had to go for abolition of slavery. It was pretty much committed. But when you're talking about involvement of African Americans in military, even as late as World War II, in terms of the jobs that African Americans were given in the military, you had the Port of Chicago explosion, for example, where black servicemen were loading munitions onto ships. That's what they did. They weren't allowed to go into combat. they were loading munitions, and white officers were under quotas for how fast they could get those munitions on, and then were placing bets with one another that they could get munitions on faster than the other officers. And believe it or not, a ship exploded and vaporized a whole bunch of the port of Chicago. But going back to the Civil War, the South also, second thing, couldn't really arm the people that they had held in servitude, such as they had, because they're giving them guns. And
at a certain point in the Confederacy Army, they weren't usually fighting with guns unless there was an actual battle. I mean, the supplies were in short. I mean, you would people. This is like the Revolutionary War. You bought the gun you had at home with you. You weren't guaranteed a gun if you signed up for the army.
Yeah, but people were fighting against the war itself. I mean, parts of the South had seceded effectively, and so you had this leadership of the South that was trying to preserve an institution in slavery through this whole military campaign, and then you had all these people dying. Now let's, in terms of the movie, then we're back.
Well, one thing I want to mention that we haven't is the Corwin Amendment. That the original 13th Amendment, actually, there was
At the beginning of Lincoln's first term.
Lincoln's first term, that would have, in the Constitution, perpetuated or prevented Congress from passing a law repealing slavery. And actually, Lincoln supported that in his inauguration speech.
Well, Lincoln
not
supported
real
it,
directly, but he said, that's what the Constitution says, and I support that.
And
We've
it was
always
one of-
been a people of compromise. And it's, Shelby Foote pointed out, the great historian Shelby Foote pointed out, we've always thought of ourselves as a people of compromise.
I have.
When it came to a very difficult issue of slavery, we had to go kill each other on a mass scale. But, you had compromises within the Constitution itself. You had great compromises in 1820 and 1850. On and on it went. So this was a last gasp attempt by some of the, really older politicians, more moderate politicians, that this was something that we were going to put in place to prevent this war, which seemed to be kind of like a train just rolling down the tracks.
And legislatively, the other thing Lincoln tried to do at the outset of the Civil War was just to ship a truckload of money to every slave owner and to just buy the slaves and then give them freedom. So the constitutional amendment was not the only thing Lincoln proposed. It was one of several things that just never took off.
Right.
Well, and then in the movie, the thing that comes through that I don't think people appreciate, and I don't know, and here's where we go into historical accuracy and the question thereof. And for another thing is, Lincoln never is a vampire in this film, and
He's not gay either.
in the late 1800s, there was a joke that the best-selling books at that time were books about Lincoln, dogs, and something else. And so somebody said, "So we ought to just have a book about Lincoln's dog doing such and such." Ha ha ha. Well, okay, so vampires and Lincoln, so they're making anyways. It's nearing the end of the war. Everybody can see that the war is about done. Sherman has marched through the South. Grant the Butcher has killed a lot of people. The South is on its knees. They were wanting to sue. Amendment is as it's depicted in the movie, and the thought was, if there had been peace, two things. One, it would have been a recognition that the South was an independent country and had legitimacy in secession. And two, they would have insisted that they keep their slaves and, their slaves as human property, and that would have defeated a big purpose of the war.
That is one of the things the movie depicts pretty accurately, where when Grant's talking to the delegates from the Confederacy, and he tells them these terms aren't good enough, go back to your people and do it again. And they ask Grant, "What do you want from us?" He's like, "I want you to surrender." Because this isn't negotiations, it's not treaty signing. This is you surrendering to us because we're both citizens of this country. You just decide to revolt. So
Well, yeah, that was an important point, because otherwise, I mean, they as Lincoln said at one, or is it depicted as saying at one point in that movie, "Look, once it's all over, I don't care if Jeff Davis and the others leave the country, when my back's turned, that wouldn't bother me at all." Because they'd committed treason.
And Lincoln's idea of Reconstruction was definitely much different than what actually happened. And we probably can touch on that in the next segment. But he was not part of the radical republicanism that wanted to basically make the South into military zones and break up the plantations and stuff like that. That was Lincoln's idea.
See, the problem, and it's very crass to say this, but it's true. One of the great things that happened to Abraham Lincoln was the fact that he was assassinated at the end of the Civil War, and he did not have to deal with the thorny issue of Reconstruction. Because what do you do with these people who supposedly have committed treason? What do you do with all of these freed African Americans? What do you do to sort of get these former Confederate states back within the Union itself?
Or these cities burned down, these plantations.
And you had to
ruined.
rebuild and whatever else.
I'll have to consider that statement. I don't know if it's crass so much. It's like, gosh, if I get shot this afternoon, at least I don't have to worry about dealing with my job tomorrow. I mean, that's kind of.
But in many respects, he did not go into that real mess, so he did not tarnish his legacy as, sort of this great emancipator that did tremendous things and kept the Union together. Rather, it was, left to those behind.
He was not a popular figure even right at the time of his death.
Oh, indeed.
I mean, he was. There were a lot of people who hated Lincoln. For one thing, a lot of people in the South obviously did. A lot of people in the North hated Lincoln because they didn't think that he'd prosecuted the war adequately. They didn't think that he had gone quickly enough for abolition for various reasons. That he had prolonged the war. That we shouldn't have had a war. That he blundered into a war. Once we were in the war, he lost all these battles because he didn't have the right generals. He was not well liked. So when we sit here today and say, well, he was one of the great American presidents, and I think my personal opinion is he was. At the time, a whole lot of people not only would have disagreed with me, probably would have beaten my butt, telling me that I was wrong.
One of the great things about Lincoln's personality was the fact that he was able to ignore tremendous insults that all of us, or many of us at the time would have wanted to fight a duel over, because Stanton referred to him in terrible terms, and I'm sure Lincoln got wind of it. If you snubbed him in any way, he'd forget about it later, and that was one of his greatest skills. McClellan would snub him constantly, and here was his general.
He was challenged to a duel one time, and
James Shields, yes,
and he said, "Choice. I get the distance and the choice of weapons. Cow manure at 100 paces." and he did let things kind of blow past him, and he didn't hold things personally. In the movie, I think that's portrayed. That's one of the elements that they portray Lincoln as being, as not concerned with personal ridicule, which he caught an awful lot.
Well, it's not just he caught it; he invited it, because he invited a bunch of people who didn't agree with him into his cabinet, into his inner circle.
Which is just astonishing to us now. It'd be almost the equivalent of let's say a Mitt Romney had been elected if he had pulled in all of those candidates that had torn him down in the primary
The White
to
House,
be part of his cabinet.
The White
Whereas
House
nowadays-
isn't that big.
but
the
you would
White
think-
House isn't that big.
Whereas
But
now
we would be shocked by something like that. It'd be in some ways it's equivalent to what President Obama did with bringing in Hillary Clinton into his cabinet.
Or
But
John
they are
Roberts.
somewhat. But if for instance, if he had brought somebody in that just tremendously disagreed with him into his cabinet, we would just be shocked by such a thing. Lincoln filled his cabinet with those kind of people.
And in the movie, that is shown in part. They shows and that was somewhat disappointing, is that they didn't show a lot of interaction with the cabinet. And we're going to be back here in just a minute with our last segment. Right back.